G'day legends, I hope that you're having a fantastic day and so far a fantastic week and a big day for me. Due to my surgery a few months back, there was a period of time which my license was temporarily suspended. That time is over and I'm back on the road, so watch out. But legends, of course, today we have a lot to go over. Of course, we will look at the maps and we'll look at different maps, see where things are moving, but we are going to zoom in on some specific areas of the maps and how this is telling us a lot about the informational sphere, the political sphere, and the military sphere as well. So we'll zoom in on that and we'll have a really good look at how things are actually happening. Then we need to talk about the end of the war and what Trump has said, what Zelensky has said, and where that middle ground may or may not be found. While we're speaking about Trump, we need to look over some comments he made about the killed in action soldiers in this war. And we need to look at what we can confirm, what are the truths that we know, and where is there room for speculation in that. So we'll go over that as well. We also need to look at what Zelensky has said about NATO troops entering Ukraine as a peacekeeping force, but it won't just be hanging out in the center of Kyiv. Firstly, what I want to show you, and I've said that I think at this point in time, as far as weapons development, the first thing that Ukraine should be trying to develop at this point in time are fiber optic controlled drones. Due to the success we are seeing Russia have with these weapon systems. I know Ukraine all the time tend to have new weapons in the pipeline, but a lot of the time we never actually see these weapons ever enter the battlefield. But we have seen photographs come out overnight of a Ukrainian fiber optically controlled drone said to have a spool of fiber optic cable of 41 kilometers or 25.5 miles. Now remember, that is the range on the spool. It's not as the crow flies. It's not just a radio signal going that far. You start looping back and forward, that range is reducing due to that's your total length of flight, not how far away you are from the operator. But I believe it is in Ukraine's interest right now to get those to enter the battlefield successfully and en masse as soon as possible due to the success the Russians are having with this. But we need to look at Velyka Novosilka, and some comments made tells us a lot. So of course, here is Ukraine in the center of your screen, the capital of Kyiv. The red area is occupied since 22, purple since 2014, and of course the red check that you're going to see on the map today is ground that Russia has made over the previous 24 hours. And you can see on the southeastern side of Velyka Novosilka, Russia has continued its advancement in this direction. And if we look at the Syriac maps here, there's ongoing clashes on the western side, roll the way up to the Nokryali, and as well ground being made on the eastern side. This is now lining up with what this map showed us over the past few days of updates and on Syriac's most recent in the same general direction as where this red check is today. We can see further movement. So we can confirm that Russia is continuing to move through Velyka Novosilka. Why is this so at risk? Well, due to the pocket that has formed, but especially the Nokryali waterway running through here and other waterways, there is a huge risk of encirclement here, not only physical encirclement, but strategic encirclement. And that's why I don't like videos of things getting blown up and whatever, but I have to use it. We talk about war. It's why over the past days and weeks, I've shown you footage of Ukrainian tanks getting taken out approximately here. Other vehicles up around Novaya Komar around here, and there's more footage in these areas today. And what I'm saying, the reason I show you that is it shows that even withdrawal out of here is incredibly dangerous and further complicated by crossing waterways and Russia's drone coverage in these areas. But maybe we are wrong, because RBC Ukraine is reporting today that Ukraine's forces assess risk of encirclement, okay? Currently, there is no risk of the town of Velyka Novosilka in the Donetsk region being surrounded by Russian forces. I guess there isn't risk, I guess, if it may be already strategically surrounded. This comes from the spokesperson for the Kotsia Operational and Strategic Grouping of Troops, Viktor Tuhobov. He says there is no threat of encirclement there because in the event of this, there is an opportunity to retreat. The distance and coverage are not sufficient. Not sufficient for what? Is there an opportunity to retreat? It's going to be incredibly difficult. You don't need to be an analyst to have a look and go, this is strategically encircled, and that's why I've shown you some of that footage, and the range of the drones operating in here is definitely sufficient as per the geolocated footage I've shown you. So there is a threat of encirclement, or it is already strategically encircled depending on that drone and artillery coverage. He emphasised that in the area of Velyka Novosilka in this direction, there are heavy battles and any development of the situation is possible in any direction. I think we'll see large counterattacks to try and break the forces that are in here at the moment out. And this is what I showed you back on the 20th of January, being reported by Ukrainska Pravda, saying from soldiers on the ground, it has been impossible to access Velyka Novosilka by vehicle for several weeks. Logistics are extremely complicated. So who are we to believe in here? And withdrawal is going to be a nightmare. And in the past several weeks, in the past 24, 48 hours, the situation in here has deteriorated very rapidly. But there is definitely threat of encirclement, absolutely there is, and manpower shortages. And Ukrainska Pravda, in a different article coming out today, 110th Brigade on Velyka Novosilka has plenty of firepower, but no troops. And this goes against the rhetoric we hear again and again, because it allows then officials to shift blame away from themselves. But the rhetoric that there is no weapons, no ammo, no artillery, but there are plenty of troops. But we hear again and again from other sources the absolute opposite of this. And I wonder when bloggers, keyboard warriors will stop ignoring that and either feel the pressure to go and sign up or report on this actually being the truth at the front, that there are weapon shortages, there are ammunition shortages, but in my opinion, and I think this is shared by a lot of people, especially offline, is the main problems being faced is manpower, command issues, and then these weapons. But of course, people turn around and go, well, X, Y, or Z, if you're willing to have more men thrown into this, why are you not at this point going to sign up? Okay, let's go over this. I'm going to talk more about manpower issues and post-war attrition. Ukraine's 110th Separate Mech Brigade, commenting on the situation near Velyka Novosilka and Donetsk, have emphasised that despite having sufficient artillery and drones, the units are facing critical shortage of personnel in the infantry divisions. Quote, compared to Avdiivka, the reasons for losing territory are different. In Avdiivka, there was a shortage of artillery rounds and FPV drones were just starting to develop. But infantry was still present. Back then, the absence of artillery was made up for by the troops. Now, however, there is enough artillery and drones, but there are not enough soldiers to fight. There is a complete shortage of personnel in the infantry units. The soldiers said that a typical Russian assault operation involves several groups of 4 to 6 individuals attacking Ukrainian positions from different directions. The most intense activity occurs at dawn, when reduced visibility due to fog and rain makes aerial reconnaissance, so by drones, more difficult. The Russians move through these heavily wooded areas and they use the vegetation to shield themselves from these drones and being seen and physically hit also. Quote, hitting a moving target with artillery is extremely difficult, and in such cases, cluster munitions are somewhat effective. Targeting FPV drones in a grove is challenging due to the radio horizon, so the curvature of the earth and where that radio signal can go. Fibre optics get around this, and the branches that obstruct accurate hits. Moreover, enemy groups now often include soldiers with automatic shotguns, and they are able to shoot down our drones, but Nafe on Ever Online told me that shotguns are a cope, just like the cages we see on top of modern tanks, including the most modern tanks is even the Makavas that Israel operate as well. It may not be perfect, but I'd much rather have some bloke with a shotgun than some bloke with nothing. Further, the soldiers explain that when the Russians approach populated areas, they take cover in buildings or more often in basements. Aerial reconnaissance identifies their location and artillery adjusts its fire. But due to several challenges, such as human factors, worn-out guns, and a variety of munitions, hitting precise coordinates is difficult. Quote, as a result, the shells land roughly in the target area. We fire about 10 rounds for adjustments. FPV drones are accurate, but their small payloads can't destroy a basement or building. When the enemy realises we've adjusted our fire, they move about 100 metres to a new building, and the cycle starts over. That's how they advance. Infantry could stop them, but there's no infantry. In such battles, it's infantry and assault troops that should be tasked with clearing buildings and halting the enemy's progress. In one day, our brigade eliminates more enemies than some of our battalions have personnel. And manpower is something that should be spoken about more as a major factor for why Ukraine is moving rearwards at the moment, but it is massively ignored. So let's go over why there are manpower issues and how this is not only affecting the situation now, but can affect the situation even once the guns have gone silent in what we refer to as post-war attrition. And we're going to jump forward and back on a couple of slides and some slides that you'll see later on in this video. That Zelensky, speaking at Davos, has spoken about then mobilisation. Under Ukrainian law, only men over the age of 25 can be drafted. Of course, recently the law was changed from 27 down to 25. And even then, there are numerous exemptions which limit the supply of additional manpower. Officials from the US and other Western allies have been urging Ukraine to lower the age of conscription, while Zelensky insists there is more need for guns and missiles than for more soldiers. Except if you listen to things like that and read stuff coming off the very front line, saying, why mobilise even younger people? So that there are even more people without weapons. But in my opinion, under President Trump, this will be one of the primary conditions for further aid if the war doesn't stop. That if you're not willing to negotiate and the war is going to continue, you need to lower your mobilisation, your conscription age, down to be at least in line with the US. The US has said under President Biden that send us men and we will train and arm them. And of course, this manpower problem, and especially then drafting younger people, creates a lot of problems. Of course, there is fear to conscript younger people because, of course, they are the future of the country. And we see articles like this coming out today. This is from Kyiv Independent. 1/5 of Ukrainians would move abroad if travel restrictions were lifted. So, of course, men aged 18 to 60 are not allowed to leave the country due to martial law, except if you've got specific reasons or you are wealthy enough or a famous YouTuber. But according to the survey, men and younger people were more keen to move abroad. 25% and 33% respectively. Only 9% of respondents over 60 expressed willingness to move abroad. But of course, these young people that are a third of this or more, that they are the most important to keep. My question is, how is Ukraine going to stop this? Of course, if the war ends and martial law is going to be lifted at some point, democracy is going to then be put into Ukraine. If they want to join EU and NATO and all of this, that has to then come back in. How are they going to stop this while wanting to maintain an army of 800,000 personnel while rebuilding the economy? How are they just going to stop people leaving? I know the EU may look at immigration, but in my opinion, this will not have the desired outcome at all. It could actually have the exact opposite of wanting this as well. And if Ukraine is not in NATO or in the EU, without trillions of dollars in support over decades, it will fail as a state. And Putin could win in a decade due to long-term or post-war attritional effects. And this is everything from the resources down in the east, the resource-rich agriculture, the mines we see about around Pokrovsk. If they fall on the other side of the border and there isn't economic prospects there, it will have a flow-on effect. And Tatarigami UA has spoken about this, and we've spoken about this at length. Last year, I argued that an unfavourable peace would endanger Ukraine's future, driving more Ukrainians to leave. New statistics now confirm this, adding to the already significant exodus. Without solid security guarantees, prospects are bleak, and young people will just leave. And if Ukraine isn't in NATO, they're not in the EU, and those options aren't there, that economic prospects, the security, people will just leave. And I still think, regardless of how this ends, people will leave anyway because there's been partners and families living outside of Ukraine for over 3 years where the economic opportunities are significantly higher. But we'll come back to that in a little bit. We'll jump back onto our Velyka Novosilka and how this is all affecting. We look at the manpower happening here, and this isn't just here. This is all over the front line. And we talk about then after the war, how do you then keep people? So let's go over attritional war. And I think the biggest success that Russia is having, the reason is they have accepted that this is attritional war. So my question just to an AI is, what is the ultimate goal of attritional war? If you don't have the capacity then to further occupy the land, and for Russia to occupy Lviv or Kyiv or even Kharkiv is going to be incredibly difficult and costly. I don't believe they have the capacity to occupy that, but in attritional war, what's the goal then? If occupying land is not an option, the ultimate goal of attritional war becomes denial and exhaustion, denying the enemy their objectives, exhausting their ability to fight, and creating conditions where continuing the war is untenable for them. So, of course, both sides are trying to do this, but we are seeing in the attritional phase, in my opinion, Russia is winning the attritional war. And we'll look at KIA wounded in action later. Victory is achieved not by holding territory, but by undermining the enemy's ability or willingness to sustain the conflict. And the ability to do this with having the men to do it, the willingness to conscript those men, the domestic production of weapons, the international productions of weapons, and in Ukraine's case, international support further. So we go back to the problem of a lot of people then leaving, and what I said was Putin could end up actually meeting some of his earlier objectives if Ukraine isn't in NATO or the EU due to attritional war, even when the guns fall silent. And this is known as post-war attrition. And post-war attrition is the continuation of effects of attritional warfare after active fighting has stopped. It refers to the long-term weakening of a country through the lingering consequences of war, such as economic ruin. And we have seen that some of the major agricultural areas and metallurgical coking coal mines have been either destroyed or occupied by then Russian forces or destroyed on moving rearwards. And this is going to make it very, very difficult, especially if you're wanting to maintain an army of 800,000 troops. Population loss, depopulation due to casualties, immigration, and displacement. And that goes into a third of people looking to leave. And of course, significant casualties in the war, not just KIA, but wounded in action and mental scars as well. And not just people who fought, people that have been in these areas that have been incredibly hot. Brain drain, loss of skilled workers and professionals who fled during the war or have been killed in the war or who will immigrate afterwards. Political instability, ongoing unrest, weak governments, and societal divisions. Again, instability in the Ukrainian political sphere, I think, is a realistic problem if Ukraine doesn't get a position of strength outcome from this war. Humanitarian struggles, refugee crisis, poverty, and a lack of basic services. And this all goes into leaving the country in ruins. The goal result is that the effective country remains too weak to recover, rebuild, or pose a future threat. And what we have spoken about is that Russia's goal here, winning through attrition. That's how Russia want to win, is through attriting down. And it's not just attriting forces, it's attriting economic potential, the stability of the nation, all of this as well. And even if the guns fall silent, if there's not acceptance into NATO, the EU, and lots of people leave, could be massive problems. But at the same time, if Ukraine then do mobilise those 18 to 25, your main young humans who are going to procreate and repopulate, that's going to be a huge problem also. So I guess we will see. So before we go over more of these troops in KIA and ending of the war, let's have a look at the maps and see what is changing. So of course, on this map, you can see a lot of red check, especially around Shevchenko. And this is the Kursk pocket becoming the Dashny Ulanki pocket here, as well as just to the north of here in Yasnovi, Surabini. So let's look at Kursk across a couple of maps. Now, yesterday we spoke about Shevchenko and how Ukraine had a successful pushback of the Russian forces here. We saw that red move back, grey expand. Suryak is confirming this movement today. Kursk number 2, we can see, of course, down in the pocket where this has moved on the red here, that Russia has had advancement here. We can line up between these maps that is matching as well. It's now matching around the Shevchenko front also. Then we'll come up into Pokrovsk, Yasnova. You can see a large amount of ground. Uspanivkia, this has closed up. That's not a surprise. And as well, more ground being made in between Udashny, Kotlene, of course, wanting to head for this road to cut off Pokrovsk itself. So we have a few maps here. And as we can see, around Udashny, this lines up with what Deep State said yesterday. Remember yesterday where my cursor is, there was a small movement back of the Russian forces here. So he's confirming that that movement did happen, as well as more down right around then the, what was I saying? Surabini direction 2. But we have another Suryak map for you today, and we can see further movement out from Kotliny, confirming in the direction of which this map is showing. So, of course, trying to build the flanks of Pokrovsk, this being the western flank, and of course, Baranivka, this being the eastern flank, trying to get to this intersection to have a cut-off of resources all the way from Pokrovsk, Konstantinivka, down into Toretsk, forming the eastern side of a flank of Pokrovsk, but the western side of a flank potentially of Toretsk, Konstantinivka, and eventually maybe on the western side of Pokrovsk, but that would be a long time away. Let's have a look at the east here, and we can confirm Baranivka, there is movement across both of these maps. Although they're saying the Russian army took full control over the forest and plantations here, so there has definitely been an advancement in this general direction. Toretsk, no updates across the maps today. Chasiv Yar, some movement today. I don't have a map backing this up. And then we'll move up, and of course we have Terny in here, Yampalivka, Ivanivka, where Russia has crossed this and is continuing to move to the west. We have this map here showing significantly more movement, again, all the way even further than what the grey zone is showing on this map. So we'll wait for any confirmations of this. We move just north of here and we're looking for Raihorodka. This is one area in which it's hard to know what exactly is happening around Nadia in here, and we can see Russian army continued increasing buffer zone around Nadia. So this is just this part where my cursor is at the moment, saying that there is then occupation out through an expanding control there. Again, wait and see. We move up into the northeast further. So, of course, we're in Kharkiv Oblast at this point in time, crossing from Lugansk across. And this is Dovorichnia here. You can see the border between the oblasts here. We've seen Russia not only successfully make a bridgehead across the Oskil, but further expand that week on week. We can see today being no different. Situation on the northeastern front. During last days, Russia made new advances southeast of Dovorichnia and north and south of Zapadny, despite the latest reports the locality wasn't taken. So significant updates. We see where Zapadny is right in here and this tree line. So he's talking right out in here and between this area and Dovorichnia. So significant updates if that is to be true. Let's have a look at what Surik has said about this. What looked like a brief Russian incursion across the Oskil in late November has turned into a major bridgehead that may change the dynamics of this front in the coming weeks. The Ukrainian army has a serious manpower problem in the northeast of Kharkiv, and together with the weak fortifications have allowed the Russians to advance where by mid-year it would have been impossible. Although everything seems to indicate that future movement of the Russian forces will be able to advance towards Kupiansk from this shore, it is certain that the cross-border activity further north has intensified, allowing the Russians to carry out incursions and reconnaissance work several hundred metres into Ukrainian territory. This may mean that the Russian army plans this operation similar to May 2024 north of Kharkiv, creating a new buffer zone that will force Ukraine to send reinforcements there and thus prevent a repeat of the Kursk offensive. Meanwhile, the situation will continue to deteriorate on the eastern front, where the battle for southern Donetsk is very close to an end. And of course, the entry into Dnipro Oblast. But basically, saying that Russia, as the numerically superior force, that they'll just push on all different fronts and it will then deteriorate the situation down in the south and the east, and it will take away and jeopardize Ukraine's ability to have more operations like they're crossing into Kursk. So that's all the maps we have for you today. But let's talk about Zelensky and NATO troops. And I actually want to start on this one. He gave details how an international peacekeeping operation could function if an agreement could be reached between Ukraine and Russia. In an interview in Davos, saying, from all the Europeans, 200,000 combat troops. It's a minimum. It's a minimum. Otherwise, it's nothing. So if it's 199,999, it's nothing. 200,000 should be the bare minimum. He ruled out reducing Ukraine's army to a fifth of its 800,000 strong size. But economically, how is this going to be maintained, refitted, retrained with how this war is looking like it may end? That is a huge, huge number when we know once martial law is lifted, there may be a huge exodus of 30 or more % leaving then the country. So let's look at what Zelensky has said here, and I'm just going to drag the slider across as it's a bit easier to go, I guess, at that speed. It is great if we will have troops. The troops will not be in the centre of the capital. They will not have a relaxed time. They're not going to be hanging out in the centre of Kyiv drinking beers, because it's very important, because I heard that some allies have said Yes, but it's okay. We can have some in the centre of the city. But no. That we don't need a contingent in the centre of the city. We need these people with our people, of course, on the front lines, because this means security. That's it. But it can't be without the United States. Talking about how much pull the US has over NATO and the accepting Ukraine into NATO or accepting peacekeeping missions also. I'll explain to you why. Even if we have some European friends, I think it can be. It will not be. First of all, nobody will risk without the United States. The second, what can divide NATO, divide the US and USA, that is a goal and dream of Putin, is to divide this unity. So, of course, we have said, if this war in some way can further divide the EU and NATO, that is a huge win for Putin and Xi Jinping. But European countries will not deploy soldiers into Ukraine without US support. It's too much of a risk to be operating this outside of NATO. But of course, we've spoken about the large manpower shortages, but if Russia do occupy, then resource shortages and ability economically to keep people there, to rebuild and maintain that army too, with even post-war attrition, could be catastrophic as well. What we spoke about in these slides that we showed you earlier with a large exodus, and that's going to grow the longer and longer this war goes on, and an unfavourable peace would endanger Ukraine's future. And in attritional war, long-term post-war attrition, this may be what Russia is looking for. We attrit down as many Ukrainian forces as possible, we destroy as much infrastructure as possible, and even when the guns then fall silent, we may be able to continue then gaining anyway, even without shots fired, if they're not in some alliance or people wanting to move across borders. So there may be a lot longer term goals in this, and attritional war isn't just stopped when the war ends as well. There can be huge bounce backs of population. In some countries, you saw this following the Second World War, but it can also be quite the opposite. And if Ukraine doesn't get a good deal out of this, and the people don't feel like what they fought for and sacrificed for then gave the promises, I think there's real risk of either internal instability or massive emigration leaving also. So let's look at what Trump and Zelensky have said about the end of the war. And Zelensky continues on this: Russia must return to pre-invasion borders. Only then would it be a fair opportunity to start negotiations. So Zelensky is only willing to start negotiations when Russia returns to pre-invasion borders. Now, I don't know if he's talking 22 here or 2014, but either way, this is a long way away from Russia gaining tens of square kilometres every day at this point in time. So if that's where it's going to start, there is no negotiations are going to take place. And again, we don't know exactly the capacity that the Russian economy is in. If they can sustain that economy, they can sustain the war. Again, with casualty figures and stuff, we're going to go over that, but it's always almost impossible to know. Trump has posted on socialtruth.org, whatever it's called: I'm not looking to hurt Russia. I love the Russian people and have always had a very good relationship with President Putin. And despite the radical left's Russia hoax, we must never forget that Russia helped us win the Second World War. It was Russia that stormed Berlin. Yes, they had other support, but as far as I forgot who made the quote, but it said, you gave us machinery, but we gave our men. Losing almost 60 million lives in the process. I believe it's more about 27 million. But anyway, all of that being said, I'm going to do Russia, whose economy is failing, and President Putin a very big favour. Settle now and stop this ridiculous war. It's only going to get worse. The problem is the calculation that I believe Putin and the Kremlin is making is, our economy is on a downwards trend, but the military capacity of the Ukrainian army is on a much more quickly downwards trend, and that will meet that collapse before we do, and that's when we can seek a better deal. If we don't make it a deal, and soon, I have no other choice but to put high levels of taxes, tariffs and sanctions on anything being sold by Russia to the United States and various other participating countries. The problem is a lot of these sanctions, basically all of it, has already been in play, but you can still affect oil and gas prices, but it will affect Russia. Let's get this war, which never should have started if I were president, over with. We can do it the easy way or the hard way, and the easy way is always better. It's time to make a deal. No more lives should be lost. But again, talking about get along with Putin. We need to make a deal. And Putin has always said that Russia is open to negotiations. So is Lavrov. But they say again and again that they must reflect the reality on the ground. And in my opinion, the reality on the ground currently is not in a position of power for the USA or for Ukraine. And the deal being made, if it were to reflect what's actually happening, will be seen as a Russian victory and in Russia's favour. And that means even if they don't take anything else at this point in time, and Ukraine would not recognise those territories, Zelensky has said, no matter what happens, we'll never recognise those territories. So that territorial dispute can cause issues for joining of the European Union, of NATO too. But again, Putin has said that they're open, but reflect the situation on the ground. And I don't believe a deal put forward by Putin that reflects that. I don't believe an American administration can agree to that, and especially not then Zelensky's government. And I do believe, refer to the podcast in the top of my description of this video with an economist, that Trump has a view that American global hegemony is as it was in the 1990s and 2000s when it comes to their economic power, placing in tariffs and taxes. But of course, that has changed massively. And what we brought up in the interview was when Trump tweeted out, or whatever they call retruth on this website, about if BRICS wants to de-dollarize, we will tariff everything. And basically what is said in that interview is that may have worked a few decades ago, but now with BRICS representing much larger land, much larger economy when you put a purchasing power parity, and of course much, much larger population, that won't have the desired effect. It could actually have a huge backfire as well. So I think Trump believes that US dominance, although US is dominant, it's not as dominant. That dominance has been reducing through other parts of the world increasing, and of course internal issues in the US, that it may not have actually to the level of desired effect anymore. But this is why I do say I think we will see Putin really, really in the next, and this was in my 2025, what's going to happen in 25 and beyond video, speaking about I think we'll see more of Putin trying really hard to force BRICS into some sort of de-dollarization that, of course, will massively buffer the losses that the ruble has had over this war, but further reduce US hegemony, but also increase what we hear from Dugin to Putin to Lavrov and even Xi Jinping and Wang Yi speak about the of evolution from a unipolar to multipolar world. And BRICS de-dollarization definitely can have this effect. So I want to talk about these killed in action figures. Now, you know me, any figures coming out, take it with a grain of salt, but people really wanted me to speak on this. So this is now President Donald Trump.
Numbers that almost 1 million Russian soldiers have been killed. About 700,000 Ukrainian soldiers are killed.
So he's said in this, and people, it's funny because it seems like both sides of the aisle are only quoting a tiny bit of this. He says nearly 1 million Russian soldiers are killed, 700,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed. Now, with me, I don't think any numbers, I don't take into account any numbers. At best, that is referring to wounded in action, missing in action, and killed in action, and everything in between. Remember, wounded in action can be counted multiple times, but this is even above the Ukrainian defences figures given out, which we throw a lot of question onto. But what is being missed in this is, let's take it for truth for a second, that Russians have had 1 million casualties, and Ukraine has had 700,000 casualties. In a war of attrition, that shows that Russia is winning still by a long way. If it's only 30% higher, but has a population of 3 to 4 times more, that is a critical situation evolving. But let's talk about KIA and go over some of these slides I've seen from a very interesting Twitter post here from @NewRules Geo or Geopolitics. He says, is there any independent evidence to support such Russian casualty figures as far as that million or those put forward? What is also worth mentioning is only last month, Trump claimed that Russia had lost 600,000 soldiers. So the legitimacy of figures is always in question. But is there any independent evidence? Well, MediaZone on the 17th of January put it at confirmed 88,726 soldiers. But as far as outside of that, No. The only source of these numbers, he's correct, is Ukraine and NATO governments other than Media Zone with a number that is substantially lower. This begs the obvious question, can you trust Ukraine and NATO or Russia to provide accurate and impartial casualty estimates on the opposition? Absolutely no, you cannot. Here's the reason why you shouldn't believe Ukraine, NATO or Russian estimates of then casualties on the other side. This works both ways. They have a political incentive to over-exaggerate. Of course they do. They have a track record of lying about casualties. Both do. It is notoriously difficult to accurately estimate the other side's losses. Absolutely. An ATACMS or an Iskander hits a bunker 200 kilometres away. How are you saying that has 50,000 North Koreans in it? Also, at this point in time, I actually do not believe that Putin or Zelensky know to the figure how many losses they have had either, with how many soldiers are in this and the chaos that can occur over weeks and months on the front line too. So I actually believe both countries may not know, don't have a good range, but not exactly. On to the next slide. So we've established that you shouldn't rely on Trump, Zelensky, Putin for credible Russian or Ukrainian casualty numbers. But these claims seem even more implausible when we examine several undisputable facts about the Ukrainian conflict, okay? And there are some facts in this that suggest otherwise. Fact number one, Russia has maintained artillery supremacy throughout this conflict. That is true. It is openly admitted by Ukrainian and Western sources. Also true. Since World War I, artillery has been the number one producer of battlefield casualties. That is also true. And Russia has maintained supremacy of artillery to a large amount. So very rarely is it 1-to-1 or even 2-to-1. Sometimes it's like 10-to-1 of the shells. And this is admitted by those sources as well. Ukraine in the beginning of the war, even the beginning, say 18 months, had FPV drone supremacy, but that has been closed, that gap, if not actually surpassed. Many will say it is surpassed, but it's at least closed, especially with fibre optic FPVs, at least in that has been passed. But as overall, I couldn't put it one way or the other for just FPV drones. Number two, Russia has maintained air superiority throughout this conflict. Now, Russia at no point has maintained complete air superiority. Has Russia had air dominance throughout the entire conflict? Yes, they have. Much larger, more powerful air force. They have had dominance over frontline sectors. Air superiority in the Russian forces and the Russian air force works slightly different to how we may see air superiority. It's in designated sectors, but to say it's superiority, no, fighters have been shot down. We haven't seen any fighters actually shot down for a long time now that I think about it. But as far as the still air defense active, the seek and destruction of anti-radiation missiles, so harm, seed and deed, so suppression and elimination of air defense hasn't occurred to the massive degree either. So no, not superiority, but definitely dominant in the air. This means that Russia has far more options for striking military targets deep inside Ukraine, which means that Russia can drop high volumes of explosives on Ukrainian positions. And this is true. From everything from FABs, so coming from typical assets such as fighter jets, through to superiority and dominance in the amount of then ballistic missiles from Iskanders, KH-59s through to your hypersonics too. So yes, there's been a large dominance in that. And he's pointing to, well, there's been dominance in artillery, dominance in this. Why are you saying then that it is one Ukrainian to a gazillion Russians? Fact 3, Ukrainian military command has a track record of reckless and costly blunders. What I'll say is this isn't exclusive. Both Russia and Ukraine have a track record of reckless and costly blunders, and especially withdrawing too late out of areas. I will say that given the track record, but this can be skewed figures because we have seen Russia on the offensive, is Ukraine definitely has a track record of withdrawing way too late, but Russia can have a track record of pushing in and in on areas, but this can be a byproduct too of attritional warfare. The failed counteroffensive in 23 when Ukraine sent waves of troops and armour across minefields with little air or artillery support. Bakhmut, Krinky, Kursk, withdrawals out of here too. What I will say about 2023 is to suggest that Ukraine had a lower casualty rate at that point in time than Russia did on the offensive into fortified lines is insane, but people will still maintain that rhetoric too. Ukraine has a critical manpower shortage. That's why recruitment officers are kidnapping random Ukrainian men off the streets and sending them to the front. That's why Ukraine has begun transferring pilots, air defense specialists, and engineers to infantry assault. All things we know are happening. We know Zelensky has had to come and try and clean up what is happening to the Air Force being sent into the infantry. Russia doesn't have a manpower shortage. The difference is, though, is this doesn't suggest that one side or the other has lost more or less. Russia has 3 to 4 times the population. So you could still have this with similar losses. But does Russia have a manpower shortage? No, they are backfilling that with large incentive to join. Ukraine does have a critical manpower shortage and shortage of morale at the front too by a series of losses. Russia has only conducted one round of mobilisation back in 2022 and does not have plans for new rounds of mobilisation, even though every couple of days people will suggest that Russia's going to have another mobilisation. At this point in time, they are meeting that just with large monetary incentive. Number 7, Russia is gaining ground while Ukraine is losing ground. Admittedly, there are historical precedents for the winning side in wars suffering greater casualties. As you're on the offensive, you are moving through, you're out of fortified positions. But usually it's the other way around. But that is taking into account conclusion of the war as well, not just individual battles, especially when the advancing side has air and artillery superiority, which is also true. Conclusion. Think for yourself. No credible evidence has been provided to support the claim that Russia has lost more men than Ukraine. In fact, there is every reason to believe that the opposite is true. I think a lot of the conclusions people come to around this is they've put themselves in echo chambers where they only see Ukrainian losses, they only see Russian losses, and don't realise that this is a war where there are massive losses across every side. But if you were to go in to a blind bloody test and say there is a side with more men, more armour, more artillery, more air power, who's going to take larger losses composed to the other side here, although there is a lot of nuance needs to be added about being on offensive action, the capability of drones as well. So to be fair, it may be very close in losses, but Russia can sustain much higher losses just due to population and due to the way we are seeing recruitment backfilling this. They've not had to have a second mobilisation. One of the things I'll say is, what happens if Russia does have another mobilisation and lifts their troops to 1.5 million? A point missing in there, though, is wounded in action receiving higher care and surviving. Russia is in Ukraine's borders, therefore has a lot further to travel inside of Ukraine to reach what I'd refer to as Role 2 or 3 facilities, basically a surgical table to then keep you alive. So a Role 1 is just primary care, resuscitation, field hospital at best. Role 2, they triage from there to higher care again. They can perform then resuscitation and treatment of shock or short-term holding, stabilization, damage control, and some surgery as well. Role 3, this is where you're stepping into more hospital settings. There's something called Role 2 Echo, which is like above that, in between these two. We won't go into that. But Role 3, this is advanced imaging, MRI, CAT scans. This is a hospital, advanced diagnostic capabilities, neurosurgery, all of this. And Role 4 is a proper, massive centre of city hospital for then medical care and further care for days, weeks, months needed. So it could be assumed that inside Ukraine's borders, Russia have a slightly worse ratio of wounded in action becoming killed in action due to the amount of area you have to travel to. Although this may be only limited, if at all, because Russia, with a lot more helicopters and ability to fly helicopters, can do much faster medevac out of some areas as well, as long as they're out of the range and visual range of manpads and range of radar as well. Ukraine have their own facilities, as of course hospitals, but they also, unlike the Russians, they have the ability to use European hospitals. So they have the ability to get these guys out to Role 1, Role 2, Role 3 through Kyiv, and then move Lviv out across the border and into Role 3, 4 facilities outside, and of course a much larger system in Europe. Russia just has Russian systems too, and the amount of ICU beds and further care may be limited as well, compared to, of course, having the whole of the European Union on hand. But I say here about Russia could be worse, being that they are they're occupying territory and have to move all the way to get to this. Kursk can be the exact opposite of this. Russian Kaz here, of course, may get higher care much more quickly in Kursk, where the Ukrainians have to medevac across a border that is absolutely saturated with ISR assets and lethal assets as Well, to suggest that in day-to-day in these areas that there is some huge ratio of soldiers, I don't see that at all. Russia, though, they have been on offensive actions for most of the war, and it could be assumed that they have had higher losses due to this. How much? Well, we don't know, but what we forget is that Russia can afford these higher losses due to their population. And I believe as well, the Russian forces and the Russian command accepting that this is attritional war, and this changes how Russia has fought and focused on more sustaining the economy and sustaining the army and attriting down Ukraine rather than a victory through some maneuver or international pressure, wanting to win through this idea of having nothing left. Both men, resources, morale, all of that. And I think Russia's just leant into that massively. And that's going to be very, very difficult after the war through post-war attrition as well. It's also going to be difficult to put Ukraine in a position of power or have convince Putin and Lavrov that they are not in a position of power, and the reality on the ground means you need to hand you over in handcuffs and back to these borders. Of course, this being basically the bare minimum of where Zelensky is sitting to start negotiating. So if this war continues, the race is Ukraine's military collapse or Russia's economic collapse. Now, with what I'm seeing, both are on trajectory. Ukraine's military trajectory, I believe, is going down much, much faster than Russia's economy at this point in time. But again, we will see. Legends, you have a fantastic day. Sorry about all the cuts. The last 4 days, I don't know what has been going on the old noggin. I'm really struggling with word recall and processing a lot of information at once. So I apologise about that. But you have a great day and I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.